So that was 2 times a woman, voting for and paying for the research and then giving your eggs to the research. The 3rd time a woman will be maybe slightly more surprising, or maybe not actually. But I'm going to talk about a company that I've done ethnographic work with here in California, who have ties to, it's a startup company, they have ties to the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, the parastatal that became into being as a result of the passage of the Stem Cell Research and Cures Act. So they have some personnel, one who was a previous postdoc funded by a grant from CERN, but they themselves have not yet been able to secure a major grant from CERN for their research. So another aspect that was kind of unique that I didn't talk about Proposition 71 was that it really did put in place this idea that when people vote directly for science, what they're voting for is the entire so-called bench-to-bedside trajectory, the entire translational trajectory from the basic science all the way to the bedside, to the products that are going to cure you, me, your brother, your sister, your mother, whatever. It's very important to the rhetoric that, and especially it's very important to the pro-cures rhetoric, that it not just work eventually over a longer time scale that might work at the federal level, but somehow this 10-year funding that's going to sunset after 10 years, that we see some results straight away and that we really make the push in California be to do the basic science so that we can translate it, translation is the word they use, so that we can translate it to the clinic and have some actual clinical trials, if not actual cures, happening by the end of the 10-year period. There is a lot of, these startup companies feature a lot in the landscape, in the imaginary. California Institute for Regenerative Medicine puts out guides, they run workshops for startup companies, and there's a lot of sharing of personnel, so people can be in their day jobs at one of the universities. It's a major recipient of funds from California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, and then in their night jobs beginning to be CEOs of some of these startup companies. So there's a lot of fungibility against these roles, but it's a separate role in terms of the imaginary. It's those people who are actually going to take the lab research and take it to the clinic and have a cure. So these companies, and in some ways you can say to yourself, well, at least it's not big pharma, right? It's not big pharma that's going to act in this monopolistic way and isn't going to tell anybody what it's doing and is going to squash all competition. And so these startup companies are definitely not demons by any means in this landscape, and not that you would necessarily think that they are, but I want to make that quite clear that they're not always already these awful capitalists who are trying to use your bodies to produce their snake oil and will be duping you in the process. So this company that I'm talking about does use Parthenope research, and so they're starting from they're deriving their stem cell lines by inducing eggs to divide as if they were embryos, and thereby avoiding the embryo politics altogether. I would be remiss not to mention that a few years after the passage of Proposition 71, induced pluripotent research became possible. So it's possible to turn, for example, fibroblast cells back into, to reverse engineer them back to state of pluripotency and to derive embryonic or pluripotent stem cell lines from them. So to some extent, the pressure on, if not volume of egg procurement, the rhetorical pressure and political attention on egg provision, egg procurement, waned after a while with the rise of IPS. And as you know, the Nobel Prize just went to Yamanaka, shared for his work on IPS cells. So in this particular company, for this particular process, you want to ask right away, well, where do these eggs come from? And I had quite a hard time finding out where these eggs are coming from. But they're coming from a couple of fertility companies, the slips that I make as I speak are always very telling. A couple of fertility clinics that are collaborating with this particular company and this particular procedure. I'm sure partly because the clinic directors believe in the research. I'm sure they think it's very, and that's a really important point to make, that no one's just evil and no one's just good either. People really do believe in this work and believe that they're doing good stuff, and they may well be right. There may be incredible fruits of this research. And certainly scientifically it's very, very interesting. But these clinics what they do is some of their patients agree to give some of the batch of eggs. So you take fertility drugs, you're young, your ovaries make 30 eggs, you decide to use 20 of them yourself, maybe you freeze some of the embryos, a couple of them the eggs don't fertilize, you have maybe up to 2, possibly even 3 put in your uterus to initiate a pregnancy, hopefully, and then you donate some of them. When this company began, at least it's slightly unclear what the incentive to donate is, but certainly the process of compensating women for the donation is firewalled. So the company is not paying the women for their eggs. It seems like it's possible, and I believe it to be true, that at least at one point the fertility clinics were giving discounts if you agreed to participate in this. And this is not unusual in the UK, for example. They have egg sharing schemes where some of the eggs go to, and you make your way up the NHS waiting list if you're prepared to engage in an egg sharing scheme, and some of your eggs go to stem cell research. So that I believe that it's the case that at least at the beginning, there were reductions. It was cheaper to get, so you might have had to have $40,000 to go through a cycle of IVF before. You might get a $5,000–$10,000 reduction if you agree to give some portion of your eggs to this company for research. But from the point of view of the company, what they do is they give things to the clinic. So there's a laundering or a firewalling or something, so it's not directly paying for the eggs. But when you talk to people who work in the company, what they say about the women, and again I have no reason to say that this isn't also true, as well as it being a way to access treatment, that these women are heroes. That's language is a quote from an interview, and that what they do it because they really want to help people with these conditions. They want to speed up the process of stem cell research and its translation to the clinic, and to help mitigate disease and disability. So they're motivated by, and it's very, very similar to what you see in egg donation. That when you interview egg donors, they tell you, say, you're doing it for the money. They say, of course I'm doing it for the money. Are you doing it for love? Of course I'm doing it for love. I wouldn't do it if it wasn't a gift of love, and I wouldn't do it if I also wasn't being paid. And it turns out that both are true. It sounds on the face of it incredibly contradictory, but in fact, it turns out to be true. And not to go into the whole aspect of the gift economy at this point, but rhetorically I think it is extremely important. So now this particular company, while they're waiting for success with an application for a major grant, either from the federal government or from CERN or from other places, and while they're kind of lurching from rounds of raising venture capital, one round of raising venture capital to the next, need to have something that generates some revenue. And again, as an aside, venture capital doesn't like basic science because they want an exit in 5 years. They want in and out with gains. They don't want, you'd be nuts to invest in something unless you're very, very wealthy and it's bleeding into the philanthropic zone. Why would you invest in something where it's incredibly unlikely that there'll be returns on your money in the kind of timescale that makes sense to your average investor? And a rule of thumb that I heard again and again during fieldwork is the 5-year. And most of these companies, none of the people who work for them think that they'll be there in 5 years. Think they'll reach that point in 5 years. So there's this kind of gap. There's this funding gap. And so what can you produce? And two very common things to produce are, on the one hand, biological tools. I'm looking at Hannah Landiker, who's written a definitive book on the rise of the living biological as tool. And the other thing that they do, and this is not the only company, it's happened in synthetic biology as well. One company that's very, very important to the recent history of synthetic biology at UC Berkeley in particular, they make cosmetics. So this one, the idea behind this is that, well, stem cells have this regenerative potential, and you've probably seen all kinds of things on the shelves that are, these Regenerist and I don't know, brands of cosmetics that use that word in one point or another. Just the rise, at the same time as the rise of a kind of aesthetic that is toward youth, a very, very gendered aesthetic toward youth, and the rise of the consumption, massive rise in consumption among men as well. So the expansion of consumption of cosmetics by men has grown exponentially in recent years, but it's still heavily, heavily gendered. And certainly by the time you get to a certain age, you are absolutely bombarded with. So if you're as ancient as me, I can't get on my Facebook or to look at pictures of my kids or anything without being bombarded about what I ought to be doing about my body and my face, because by now, my wrinkles are on the floor, and who knows what's happened to my body, and so the kind of definition of certain demographics that are highly gendered as being ones where you ought to be consuming a range of procedures and among which it's cosmetics. So what does Parthenope research have to do with face cream? Well, the idea is that by having these things that are derived from embryonic stem cells, that somehow if you rub it on your face, it'll reverse the aging process. Not clear how, but something about them being derived from pluripotent stem cell research, it'll somehow infiltrate, hook onto your skin cell, and give it some of that regenerative potential to start reverse engineering your cell, not to a state of less differentiation, which is the logic of reverse engineering to start with, but to a state of less ugly, or less old and ugly in my case. Back to this point where your pre-wrinkle state or whatever. So there's the rhetoric around these products is that you regenerative medicine, yes, but also regenerative skin cream. And so now, in fact, this one company had a very interesting campaign that was targeted at men. So last year for Father's Day, they had a campaign to reach men that had all kinds of men, on golf courses mostly, honestly, because I guess they have to have expendable income, or at least the people who love them and buy them Father's Day gifts have to have expendable income. They have to be appropriately masculine to counter the fact that they're consuming cosmetics, so it's very heteronormative in that way. They have to be, out in the sun, the exposure, so that you can really have this masculine grounds for using cosmetics. Because whereas women need to just be reverse engineered, the kind of man, the most manly man is out in the elements and really needs to protect his skin from, he's the metrosexual man who needs to protect his skin. At least in his day job, he is. And in the weekends, he's out in the mountains, and we're going to protect his skin with these products. But massively and by far. So it's interesting that they reached out in that way to men, or at least to women who might buy for men. But most of the time they're geared to women. And if you look at the SEC filings, the Securities and Exchange Commission's filings of this company, it doesn't amount to much. So the rise of these biological media and things is actually growing faster, and it's not enough to make up for major grants or for venture capital. But it's just a steady stream of income that's coming in that keeps basic office functions going, that keeps us there while some of the basic research is moved along. Okay, so that's three times in which you're enrolled into ending up paying for this complex that is the innovation complex at the moment in California around stem cell research. I don't think any of those things are things that people particularly thought about, or would even today particularly think about having been necessary for getting out, establishing California's supremacy in stem cell research. Okay, so I'm extremely ambivalent about normative conclusions always to my work. Part of me just wants to say that I'm in the business of seeing what's there, and already what's there. We have so much inattentional blindness, shall I say, given the new project, to things that aren't already troped or part of the narrative frames that actually have currency. That just saying what's there does something. It brings to light things that otherwise are very hard to talk about, or certainly are hard to talk about out of particular counter-public spaces where discussions of those topics might flourish. But because I'm pointing in some ways to things that have this fundamental ethical dimension to them, which is this disproportionate demands on a particular group of people, I felt that it was appropriate to address the question of, well, then what would one do about this? So I think that there's certainly something to be done in the realm of ethics, drawing on the particularly American bioethical document, the Belmont report from 1974, which established, along with respect for persons, the need for informed consent, and along with beneficence, that you should be able to weigh up the risks and benefits of the research. The idea of justice. It established that the selection of subjects, that some groups shouldn't be disproportionately sampled over others, and certainly you shouldn't disproportionately sample groups that are unlikely to benefit from the research. So you shouldn't be disproportionately sampling low-income people, people of color, prison populations. That it established this principle that recognized a history of discounting the personhood of some groups of people around the recruitment into biomedical research as a living subject. So certainly I think that in terms of thinking about that principle, which is already important in our bioethical edifice, there's something to say here about the fact that women, and in most of the examples I'm talking about, particular kinds of women, are being disproportionately enrolled into the research. I also want to make an argument for rhetorical change, but of course I should say that when I say rhetoric, I don't mean things that are untrue. I really don't mean to put rhetoric against speaking truth. I just mean the way that you describe things, the field, the semantics setting, the frame in which things can be discussed and will be understood. So I think it's extremely important to seek out and name gendered, raced, classed, and so on, demands and benefits of the innovation economy in general. I think that words that name things that are major actors in asking, say, the public to fund a piece of science should appear. They should be named. So eggs, embryos, women, couples should have been in the text of Proposition 71, for better or for worse. And again, it's easy to understand why you want to leave out those things, but that should be a flag itself. And then I particularly want to name I really, really hate this kind of dancing around the elephant in the room thing, this way in which in the case of science, what would be a forward-looking statement in a normal part of business. So a forward-looking statement in a business plan is something that under the law is not held to the truth. It's something that is appropriate, responsible, and reasonable to think might be possible outcome of what you're doing in this company. But it doesn't have to turn out to have been true. Lots of counterfactualism there. But it's just, so you can say, I'm going to do a company that's going to make a bus that's going to solve all our transport problems in LA. It doesn't have to turn out to be true that you make that bus and it solves all the transport problems in LA. It just has to have been reasonable and responsible to say that what I'm trying to do goes toward that, and here's my strongest possible case, and to create excitement and bring investors and so on. But when it's science, there's epistemic leakage. People think it's true. And at least if you ask people, people, if you do focus groups, if you do interviews with people, they think that it's science, so it says it's going to be doing this. It isn't just like any old business, but that it's likely to be true. Insofar, and then if you have the conversation about, well, do you think that some of the things that you find in the Securities and Exchange Commission filings, the place where they put the risks, where every possible thing under the sun that could go wrong does, you also find that on ads for medical products on TV, or on warnings on medications that up to and including death. And there's a way in which we're so inured to that we just discount it. You don't, if we all feared our own deaths, that most things we wouldn't. We take it as being a symptom of a litigious society, rather than being something that we're actually actively thinking about. If I take this pill, I may die, so maybe I shouldn't. We tend to say, okay, they had to say that. Anyway. But because, so for example, the text of this proposition, well, in my book I call it a forward-looking state. In some way it's talking about regenerating, not just regenerative medicine, but regenerating the state's economy. It's the post-silica wave that's coming. It's the biosilica wave, or bioinformatic wave that's coming. It's extreme. It's promissory, not for the future of the state, but it's also promissory in terms of the science, in a way that has this kind of double enthusiasm. But it doesn't. But it also seems to have, and it has this moral imperative as well. So it seems to have this kind of truth that people, I don't think, hold to the same standard or read with the same semiotics that they would read an ad that they were exposed to, or something. If you sat down in a dentist's waiting room and you saw, there's a new kind of toothpick that's being, sold by some company, and it told you that you really were going to increase your life by God knows how much, because everything goes in through gum disease now. That's the main cause of premature mortality. And buy our pick, and our pick's going to stop you getting gum disease. Actually, that may be true. But anyway, what do I know? I'm a product of my times. I kind of believe it. But anyway, if you would at least say, oh God, that's the pick company of San Diego, and they're always overselling their product. And oh God, what do you think, doctor? Should I get this one or should I get this one? But if the doctor is the pick company, then you're not saying, doctor, shall I get that product or that product? You kind of think, at least while you're in the waiting room, maybe when you go out, you say, what shall I believe, all that kind of doctor. But you're kind of saying, it's at least held to the standards of you tend to believe that that's the best case, that's the best state of knowledge at the moment. So what could you do to make people read it as a forward-looking state and a forward-looking statement about a forward-looking state, rather than reading it as something that is going to come true? And a lot of people have written about this complex of hype and hope and so on. So there's a lot of work on topics related to this around biomedical innovation. So one thing I would love to see is some of the things that I'd love to see a kind of plain speaking, and there's something that drives me crazy about the absence of plain speaking, and again, not just the euphemisms, although I just said that, but also things like, we already know. So our centre put on a conference called Toward Fair Cures, where we tried to really engage the question of differential access to the likely fruits of the research. But it was a very hard sell, because the first director of the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, Zach Hall, very eminent scientist, he kept saying to me, Charis, we can't solve all of healthcare's problems. It's not something that we, just in stem cell research, can solve overnight. It's a much longer history, and there's a way in which it's just not fungible. It's not us, we can't do that, and it's not our work to do it either. But at least you could say, there might be lapses in funding, and then we might make cosmetics for a while. So, you're funding that too, or you're contributing to this innovation economy that has that as one of its possible outcomes. You can substitute in any other number of ends that might not be exactly what is asked for, or that not every taxpayer will have full access to the fruits of the research. There's some way in which those things are known. Why can't we just put them in there? Why can't we modify the text? And again, not by putting a terrible thing at the end, this might turn out not to be true, up to and including death, But as plain language in the proposition itself, we find when we do scientific research, these kinds of things tend to happen. So, of course, that leads me to the point of, would the public vote for science funding in conditions of great hope and great uncertainty, and possibly unequal contributions and access, with possible trivialization along the way? Would people vote for that? Are people, are we ready for that, or would it fly? Would you? I mean, I could ask you, if you had a proposition with the kinds of phrases that I'm proposing to put in it, would you go to the booth in November and vote for it? Or would it already be so mitigated and so deflationary that you just never could get the behavior of endorsing that? But yes, that's a great thing for us right now in fiscal crisis in this state to dedicate this many $1 billion to. That's a great use of funds. Is it impossible to get there unless you do this forward-looking statement? In which case, we are back in the grounds of saying this is a forward-looking statement. It's not something that's part of science already. And then just to leave you with the following questions, does that mean that Proposition 71, according to my lights, should not have been funded? Are there alternatives to direct funding at the state level? Would there be ways to put in firewalls that seem to resonate more with our ideas about merit and a broad distribution of peer review and so on at the state level? Or alternately, should the nation, is there something, not just a happenstance of the history of modernity, that the nation state arises in many places as being the major sponsor of primary research, but is there some really important reason for that? And then finally, what does that leave us in terms of everyday people living in innovation economies about the way that the social contract with science is unfolding, and how might we intervene in that? Okay, thank you for your attention.